familiarity with that's not easily acquired these days, even in universities. I'm thinking of area studies, the history and practice of international negotiations, and of course, a working knowledge of exotic languages. It is tempting to believe that good diplomats are born, not made, and that our recruiting system should simply find such people and the rest will take care of itself. There is some truth in this because the personal qualities of integrity, empathy, problem-solving attitudes, and the ability to build trusting human relationships are critical to success as a diplomat. Traits like these, plus courage, determination, and patriotism are what made Marie Yovanovitch such an effective American ambassador to Ukraine. She had other credentials too that enabled her to go to the top of her profession, one that, like other professions, requires a solid background in specialized knowledge. My sense is that incoming members of the U.S. Foreign Service should be required to participate in a full academic year of professional education at the National Foreign Affairs Training Center. There might be a distinct part of the center that could be called the School of Diplomacy. A diverse group of future American diplomats would benefit, I think, from the integrating effects of a common learning experience. That said, there should also be a separate courses in area studies and languages. The common program should include a feature pioneered by the now-defunct Senior Seminar, a course that gave diplomats an introduction to various slices of American life. Personally, I would like to see the common course include case studies in diplomacy and many opportunities for extended talks with senior American diplomats and with those of other nations too. As a former teacher myself, of course, I have an interest in curriculum, and so I would be pleased to meet with people who are giving serious thought to what is suitable for today's realities. So now to finish up George Schultz's article, I want to be clear that I'm not criticizing the very good people in the State Department and the Foreign Service who, so far as I can see, are conducting themselves in a way that should make the American people proud of them. Nor do I mean to impute malign intent to leaders of the current administration. Several issues that will need to be addressed in a rebuilding program, and to date, this administration, the impact of social media on our national conversation being one of them. I have always believed that in the end, and probably after much impassioned debate, our national security must rest on a nonpartisan consensus framed by our shared values. So let it be in this case. Whew. Wow. So the whole article is on trust. And aside from the fact that it tickles me that the National Center for, what's it called here, the U.S. Foreign Service, National Foreign Affairs Training Center happens to be a stone's throw from where I am at this very moment, and will be for the next couple of months at least. That excites me. Perhaps I'll drop in if I can get past the security gates. I do want to actually just offer one more insight from a neurological perspective, neuroscience perspective on trust. I did work a couple of years back with Dr. Judith Glazer, who ran a coaching program and her own consulting business, wrote a book called Conversational Intelligence. And in this, she developed a model about trust, where she helped move people from fear to openness. And all based on neuroscience and how the brain works, and how, if we think about it, communication between people, we tend to think is like personality to personality, or situation to situation. But ultimately, communication between people is brain to brain, with everything that comes along with that. The fact that it's through our brain that we take in information through our senses. We either expand or constrict our perception. We take on points of view with a perspective. We interpret those inputs and then choose behaviors that determine our performance or express our potential or a possibility, and even dictate what we learn and how we learn things. So it's actually a huge piece of the puzzle. So looking at the view of trust, and then moving from fear to openness. Now, whether we talk about, as George Schultz just did in this article, he's talking about American government policy, particularly on an international level. But think about what we just went through with the American election. Think about relationships with family and neighbors that have been dented and dinged in many cases because of the voracious and volatile nature of some of the conversations or lack of conversations that have come up recently. So just to finish off then, the model of trust that you can read about in Conversational Intelligence is an acronym, TRUST, where T stands for transparency, R stands for relationships, U stands for understanding, S stands for shared success, and T stands for truth-telling and testing assumptions. So how do we move from those bigger concepts to day-to-day activities, day-to-day interrelationships with people we live with, people we work with, people who we live near? If we take T for transparency, in order to move from fear to openness, it requires transparency and accountability. And by the way, accountability tends to show up when there is transparency, because you can't hide anymore. No hidden agendas, or at least harder to hide your agenda, easier to be accountable. So transparency requires this moving from fear to openness requires transparency and accountability. In terms of the R, relationships, what we're looking to do is move from a dynamic of power over to power with. So this fits with a relatively new approach to leadership, which is less hierarchical. So instead of power over, it's power with. And couple that with parallel thinking. Now, parallel thinking is where you lay concepts, ideas, points of view down in parallel without arguing about them at the time. You lay them out, and then in order to move in terms of mental movement with your thinking process, if it's useful to dicker between the concepts or hash them out, or see if one is higher order than, or more useful or more feasible than the other, you do it at a later stage of the thinking process, so that you don't just create adversarial relationships on the way to achieving the results you want, whether it's in government or family life or neighbor life or work. U for understanding. This is an interesting one. A lot of times people listen in order to reject the point of view of the person they might partially be listening to, or waiting for them to stop talking so they can give their point of view. But this view of understanding based on the brain has you listening with empathy, or better yet, with compassion. Compassion is a higher order skill because you're not sucked into the energy of the other person, which you tend to be with empathy. So you want to listen with compassion in order to connect with the person rather than reject what it is, either them as a person, or reject what they're saying. S for shared success, moving from this need to be right to a shared or mutual success. How can we look at this as win-win rather than win-lose or lose-win? And then finally, T, the final T in trust, about truth-telling and testing assumptions. This is where we can explore reality gaps. And we talk now in the media about fake news. Well, how do we even know what's real and what's not, what's true and what's not? So rather than just buy into the whole thing, let's explore those reality gaps and the misunderstandings that seem to be generated because of them. And with that, especially when you combine all of those elements together in trust for transparency, relationships, understanding, shared success, truth-telling, and testing assumptions, we can actually move the needle on building more trust individually, in our families, in our communities, and even as George Schultz has so eloquently spoken about, in our government. So with that, I'm going to wrap up our session today. Thank you so much for being here with me on Living Legacy Leadership. I want to thank my producer, Joe Dobzinski, who always does a bang-up job. Thank you, Joe. And invite you and your friends back next week for another fascinating conversation. In fact, it has to do with how to talk to your neighbors in the aftermath of a volatile election period. So thank you for that. Do look us up also at sobradionetwork.com, Living Legacy Leadership Show, and check out GameChangerThinking.com for other courses and coaching opportunities. And of course, do remember that the life you live is the legacy you leave. Bye-bye now.